Okay, so yesterday we left off, we were kind of talking about the gender gap and the differences between male voting behavior and female voting behavior, some of the issues that they support or oppose. Some reasons for the gender gap. I'm not quite sure that I got this in yesterday, so if I did, this is just a quick review. If I didn't, this is information. We think, well, we can sort of predict or I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, that the reason for the gender gap is because of the increased tendencies of males and females in your generation. We know that there are many more males and females who are staying single or not getting married until later in their life. That it's becoming more socially acceptable to be a young woman or a young man in your mid to late 20s and not be in a committed relationship or not be married. And that wasn't always the case, that your grandparents' generation, there was an expectation that when you were in college, you were to meet the person that you wanted to marry, and then you were to marry them immediately after graduating, well, or close to it. And that would even be considered late in some people's eyes. That's even the case for like my parents' generation, so potentially your parents' generation. My mom was married by age 20 and 21, I think, and had her first child within about a year and a half of being married. I'm 25 and I am not married, nor do I have any intention to be married in the next year or so. And so because of that, it changes sometimes your outlook on specific political issues, especially because we encourage people to think for themselves, that I don't have to adopt the same political ideas or voting behavior of my significant other or of my spouse. That's a new idea. That didn't always happen. That in your grandparents' generation, it was sort of expected that you voted in or thought about things in a similar way as your significant other. And so this is where we start to see some of these gender gap issues, is because your generation has been raised to think for yourself for a very long period of time. And that can often change what it looks like. Okay, and then the last influence in voting behavior and political preferences is your geographic region. This used to be a little bit more specific earlier. The American South used to be pretty solidly Democratic, but they've actually moved more Republican in the last few decades. There's still a great deal of variability that exists between political attitudes and party affiliation within a single state. And so essentially what we're looking at is the state that looks purple. We're not red, we're not blue, we're a mixture. And that's a good thing. We want that. We want there to be Democrats living next to Republicans and independents living among them, and third parties, getting some news in specific areas of the country. When we start to see geographic regions become more polarized, then we're going to have a problem. Because when your geographic region becomes more polarized, now your representation in Congress is going to become more polarized. Meaning that if you are in a district that's Republican and that's solidly Republican, odds are good that that representative will always be Republican.
What's polarized?
Polarized means either end, either side. So a couple of graphs, these are in your book, but a political scientist, again, remember that there is a difference between a politician and a political scientist, or people who work in politics and people who work in political science. People who work in political science take visual data such as this, and they're going to try and figure out why there is a gap. They're going to try and figure out what a Republican presidential candidate is saying that attracts to men but doesn't so much to women. And they're going to try and decrease that gap as much as they can. They really want men and women to both be believing in that candidate in a pretty strong way. Same thing for a Democratic presidential candidate, but you do see that they're flipped. So we do know that predominantly women tend to vote more democratically, but obviously that's a generalization. But the piece in the middle is the piece that political scientists or people who develop political strategy, that's what they're really looking at. They're trying to figure out how can we decrease And they're looking at that in a historical sense and saying, what happened in 1992 where both of the gaps are much smaller? What happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s that really widened the gap between women and men? They're trying to figure out the reasons why those things happen. And then this is also in your book, and this is a general sense of district by district or county by county. Technically, we're a pretty purple state still. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you turn on the news or you look at Congress or other institutions of government, they don't make you believe that we are purple. That a lot of the media attention or a lot of the things that come out of politics and government make it seem as though we have red areas and blue areas, and we don't have purple areas. But in reality, we are still pretty purple. And that's what we want. We want purple. That's a good thing. You will see kind of in the Midwest, in the general center of our country, it's a little less. Part of that is because we're talking rural areas typically. When you find an urban area, you're going to find those being more purple because there are a lot more people living in that general area, and there would be a lot more perspectives there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we measure public opinion, and this generally comes out of opinion polls. Polling takes place every single day. It is a huge market. It's a huge, they spend a ton of money, politicians send a ton of money to polling data. There are independent polls, there are really well-known polls, things like that. So it's a method of questioning a small selected sample of respondents who are deemed to be representative of the total population. So they try and find ways to get to people across the country in different areas, in different ages, different genders, different socioeconomic statuses, to try and get a pretty good glimpse of a small section of our population. One of the main polls that you should know about is a poll company called Gallup. Gallup polls do polls every single day. They publish that data online. I'll show you that in a second. And every week they publish like a kind of a formal publication about what's going on in the country as far as opinion. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Sampling techniques. So they really want a representative sample. Lots of polls are usually thrown out. We have a lot of polls that happen that we don't ever see the results of. And a lot of that comes from the fact that they'll do a poll, and if they weren't able to get a representative sample, that poll isn't considered legitimate in the eyes of political scientists. So things like how many people did you poll, how many genders, like is there a pretty even distribution, race, age, but that's really difficult to do because when you think about it, lots of polls are done over the telephone now. Well, you have to assume that everyone you're sampling has access to pay for a phone. So that's already eliminating groups of people. If you do things on the internet, people who don't have consistent technology access are now being eliminated from that. And so to try and find a representative sample is extremely difficult. It's very hard to make sure that you get as many of the different groups of people as possible. They do this through a principle of randomness. This is the idea that they're going to just pick groups of people. They typically just pick names or areas or phone numbers. One of the things, if you ever get polled, the first things that they ask you are a lot of demographic questions. How old are you? What's your race? What's your income level? Did you go to college? Do you own your own home? Do you have debt? Things like that. They're trying to make sure that they're going to get a good sense of who you are in order to get a sense of if your sample is going to be needed to balance other people out. I've never been polled. Kyle was polled once, and I was freaking out. He was like, I was like, oh my God, you're getting polled! And he was like, yeah, okay, I have to listen to this now. I was really excited, and I listened in. It's an interesting idea. They're very, they try and be very, not warm, but not cold. They just try to be very scientific. They don't want you to be chit-chatty with them. They want you to be honest with them. It's an interesting phone call if you ever get polled. It's definitely something to remember, I suppose. Okay, so obviously we're gonna see some problems with polls. Number one is sampling errors. So these are things like a difference between the sample's results and the true results of the entire population. What polls tend to do is they'll publish what they consider a margin of error, basically what they think, what their prediction is of how much this would differ if every single person in the country was polled. So what they're looking at is, did they get a good group of people around geographic or gender? And if they didn't, they're going to add that a little bit to the margin of error. Now, if the margin of error becomes too large, then that poll is considered illegitimate. You don't want a very large margin of error. You want a small margin of error. Poll questions. Poll questions and push polls come together. People devote their entire jobs to figuring out how poll questions are worded, because the way that a question is worded to you often prompts you to a specific response. So for instance, if a poll called you and said, due to the recent lack of surveillance on domestic terrorism, do you feel safe in this country? Okay, that's already pushed you, and this is what we call a push poll. It's pushed you to a specific mindset, right? So the first phrase of, due to the lack of supervision in domestic terrorism, you're already thinking negatively. You hear that and you think, okay, well that must be true. And so odds are good that your response to this is that you don't feel safe because of that first part of the sentence. So there are people who are hired to word poll questions in very specific ways as not to lead you to a specific response, to give you what the information is that you need. In the poll that Kyle was given, there's a lot of rank this 1 to 10. So things like, because again, they want to try and make sure that they don't do this. So I remember like one of the questions they'd asked is, do you think the economy is doing well, 1 to 10? So they're trying to make sure that they're very scientific about it, that they're not leading you to specific answers or to specific responses. If that happens, it becomes a push poll. And push polls are usually thrown out because they're not scientific. You've already tainted your audience and they can be misleading. We also do see, though, push polls happen, especially for specific politicians. Sometimes you'll see, like, someone will call with a poll and say, you know, Representative Lynn Zabel has been doing so much about healthcare in Congress. Do you think that we have it? You know, like, they're trying to get you to say things that would be approving, you know, because then they can publish that information and that makes them look good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in the world of government. If you ever work for a politician, in fact, I would highly encourage, if you work, especially like at UW-Madison, politicians who work at the Capitol hire a lot of college students as interns. It's an awesome opportunity, even if you're not planning on going into government, but the sort of work in that bureaucracy is really interesting. But if you do, often you'll see that there is one person specifically devoted to getting a sense of what public opinion looks like. These are often considered sort of image consultants or press people. And what they're doing is their job is basically all day to scan through internet information or published information to get a sense of what do people like, what do people not like, what should their candidate be doing or saying or acting upon that might increase their support. So it's used every single day. It is a huge driving force to the legislation that you see. And I'll give you an example of this that's actually happening right now. So last night I was watching the news and I was doing something else and I wish I wasn't, because I wish I had listened to this number. But in the background I heard the anchor say that a specific percentage of Americans were opposed to allowing Syrian refugees into our country. Okay, so here's the deal, and I'll give you a little bit of background right now. President Obama has agreed to allow 10,000 Syrian refugees into our country within the next year, okay? We're doing that because Syrian refugees are kind of flooding into Europe and there's a lot of issues going on in that, and the United States has some, you know, responsibility in world organizations to sort of help out this crisis. Okay, But what's interesting about it is that yesterday in Congress, there was a bill put into place or put on for debate about monitoring these Syrian refugees and making some specific kind of barriers or checkpoints before they could become a part of our country. So we have some conservatives, some pretty far right conservatives, who would like there to be a test of religiosity, meaning that they want to test the Syrian refugees to see if they are extremists. There's another bill on the floor right now to make sure that they have an FBI background check. All refugees coming into our country do get a background check. They don't get an FBI background check, so that would be an increased thing. And so what's interesting about that is that somebody, especially like Paul Ryan yesterday, put onto the floor this idea of the background check thing. Somebody in his office has been checking polling data. Somebody in his office saw that there's a large amount of people who don't want Syrian refugees in this country, and they're going to use that information to sort of, you know, Paul Ryan now looks like he's starting to try and help the situation. That they're monitoring that even today. They're monitoring how those things work out. So remember, when you hear politicians say things, lots of times that's driven by some information or some polling information that they have been given. So something to think about. Political culture and public opinion. This really comes down to trust and confidence in the government. This is a really important thing to be monitoring. Our trust and confidence in government varies. It ebbs and flows, obviously, depending on what's going on in our country. But it's one of the biggest pieces of polling data that politicians use. When people are confident and trusting in the government can do more, right? Obviously. And when people are not, or distrustful, or do not have good confidence in the government, they tend to not be able to do as much. So the political trust and support is very, very important. And then public opinion about government. So just in general, opinion polls over the last few decades have shown a declining trend in confidence that Americans have in institutions such as the government, banks, and the police. That we just have seen this sort of declining piece. And that can be for various factors, and that's what political scientists do every day. They take numbers and they try and put reasons to those numbers and try and figure out what those numbers are saying to people. Okay, you are finished with notes when you're done with this.